Tobi Pearce, welcome to the show, mate.
Mate, Sammy, thanks for hosting me, brother.
Happy days. Mate, I want to debunk a couple things today. I want to pick some things apart. Yeah. You've been ruffling some feathers lately on social media, which I'm very happy to see.
Yeah.
I'm a firm believer at the moment that this work-life balance movement is having a detrimental effect on the way the next wave of entrepreneurs are thinking. I feel like everybody wants to buy a MacBook, move to Bali. They want to work 4 hours a week and they think they're going to make $1 million.
Yep.
They may or not be selling courses on the way through or whichever way they want to do this. But I don't think it's instilling the right message. What's your take on this work-life balance movement?
So I think at a macro level, I think the idea of work-life balance is fundamentally silly from the basis that work is a part of life. So by having this idea that you can achieve work-life balance is a representation of the fact that you fundamentally see work separate from life, and that's not a reasonable position to take. I think the idea, for some people that maybe they do want to go and live in Bali with a laptop, work a few hours a day, and make their money. That's fine if that's what they want to do. I would say the vast majority of people that attempt to do that end up failing anyway. But I think for a lot of people, and especially the the next generation of entrepreneurs, I think if they start their journey from the position that they're doing this to achieve work-life balance, that they're starting off on the wrong foot. And so there's a really funny idea. A lot of people have spoken about this before. They're like, I'm sick of working a 9 to 5. So I'll go and set up my own business so I can determine my own hours. And for anyone who's actually built a business and been somewhat successful, they'll know that you're sacrificing working 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., probably to transition to working 5 a.m. to 9 p.m., at least for the...
Your total waking hours.
100%, at least for the first few years. And so the fundamental idea here is that to create something of value, i.e. a business that generates an income and makes profit, is actually really hard. And so I think if you're getting into business and building your own business to achieve a better work-life balance, you're going to be very unhappy for probably a very long time. And even if you look at people who are employees, working their 9 to 5 or whatever they may be doing, having that mentality that your work is not an aspect of your life that is fundamentally separate is you're setting yourself up for sadness and frustration, because you're effectively not accepting that in order to live your life the way you want, you have to do work. And I think that's a really unstable foundation.
I often say that for people who are looking at their 9 to 5 and thinking that this is not where I want to be, I want to go out on my own. I always favor the service businesses and the trades specifically. They're always thinking, I'm working for someone else, this is not going to get me where I want to go. And then they go out and start on their own, not realizing that, yes, your billable rate changes, but the amount of effort and sacrifice that comes along is not equal with that.
It's not a perfect application, but an idea here that is useful for those people is understanding the concept of, in economics, what's referred to as a mispriced externality, so a cost that wasn't initially considered when pricing in a decision, if you will. And so, for those people, they're going, I get paid $50 an hour, but I'm actually billed out at $150 an hour or whatever it may be. So then, reasonably, they would say, I can go to my own business and charge $150 an hour. What they don't consider, or what is mispriced, or the externality in that scenario as well. But then you've got to do invoicing, and you have to arrange the stock or whatever it is that you're using to deliver your service. You have to buy a computer. You have to potentially have an office. You've got to do bookkeeping. You've got to do accounting, and these things are all costs. So for a lot of people, they end up going from $50 an hour to $150 an hour. But then at $150 an hour, they roughly have to pay $100 an hour or work the extra hours to actually run the business, which ends up resulting effectively back at a $50 an hour income anyway. Or less.
Or worse after tax.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Mate, I always battle with this notion, and we've spoken about it personally quite a few times. You're no stranger of hard work. You work harder than anybody that I've ever seen, not only through time, but through effectiveness. A little bit closer to home, I've been working with some of my guys as well, some of my clients, about the statement of how hard should I push. And it's a personal thing, and it's also something that we're trying to communicate, in that mentorship, mentee environment. How hard does one need to push to achieve their goals?
So in a general sense, if you wanted to get the best results and you were willing to make all of the sacrifices, then you would do as much work as you were able to whilst still being effective in that work, right? So it's not just raw hours, it's value created or effectiveness. And so if you start from the position that presumably a decent portion of people want to get the most results, then they should be happy to make the largest sacrifices. And this is where a lot of the idea for business owners breaks down, because come back to the work-life balance idea. They're like, I'm happy to work really hard, but I still want to have a good life. And I'm like, well, you're potentially like looking at this over the short term. And so what I mean by that is that if you fundamentally don't know what your limits are in terms of value creation until you push them, and then if delivering more value effectively is more effort and more time, well, then you should see how much work can you actually deliver and how hard can you actually push, right? And when they look at that, they go, oh, well, I've worked really hard this week, so I'm going to have a couple of days off. And I'm like, you've misunderstood the idea. To genuinely create significant value, working hard shouldn't be measured in hours or days, even weeks or months. It should be measured in years. And this is a very common misunderstanding from people, that they're like, oh, I can work really hard for a short period of time and generate a huge amount of value. That's just not reasonable. And even if you wanted to try to find a scenario where it is reasonable, so I can work really hard for a short period of time and generate a lot of value and therefore make a lot of money, well, that would only be true if you were incredibly effective. And most people for the first 5 years or even 10 years of their business journey are not very effective. So once you've been at it for a decade, you can work really hard in sprints and have time off, sure, because you have the requisite skill and resources to generate value. But for people who are early in the journey, you've got to pay rent, basically.
You've got to cut your teeth.
Yeah, you've got to pay rent. And I think a lot of people are not, the way that they perceive hard work is in many regards kind of misinformed. It's sort of like looking at, so if you look at athletes and you go, well, every level that you want to progress in a particular sport, you kind of have to embody or identify with the behaviors that the next level athletes would, right? And when you're going to up that curve of, skill, competency, and, the level of performance, in a simple sense, like more often than not, so those people are working far harder than the level beneath them. And if they want to get to the next level, they're working far harder again, and ideally in a more sophisticated manner as well. And business is kind of no different. Like a lot of people think that working, if BAU or business as usual is 38.5 hours a week, or if I'm working 45 hours a week, like I'm going really hard. And then when you see all these people who are like, oh, Elon Musk is crazy because he's working 100 to 120 hours a week. It's like, well, do you want extreme results? Because if you want extreme results, you've got to do extreme things, right? And if you're not willing to do extreme things, then don't be under the illusion that you have any chance of generating extreme results.
And normal is based on 40 hours in common perception.
Not even that, because you got to remember, like when kids come out of school, they've gone from working not at all. So working 2 days a week for them or 3 days a week is hard. And the people that you've been around, so your friends and family and even your colleagues, they kind of are your normal. The fundamental insight here is that there's no meaningfully successful individual or meaningfully successful entrepreneur that does anything normal, because you're not looking for normal results. Even if you want to be the person living in Bali with your laptop working a few hours a day, that is not a normal result, right? So if you want an abnormal result or an extreme result, you have to do abnormal or extreme things to be worthy of it.
So to get us back to how hard do I need to push? How hard do I as the collective us?
Yeah. Well,
we need to know what we want to achieve first, don't we? We can't just go that I'm going to work 100 hours because 100 is 2.5 times more than the normal person works.
You got to calibrate it with your goal.
Factor effective.
Yeah. So the level of work output and intensity that you have should be reflective of your goal. And so if you are a person who's running a small business and you only want to make a little bit more money, well then work a little bit more hard, build a little bit more skill, and then you kind of recalibrate that over time. But to my point before, if you want extreme results, you should work an extreme amount. An extreme amount probably would be 80 plus hours a week, every week. And then coming back to my previous point, not for a week or a couple of weeks or a few months, years. I think it's unreasonable to think that, and this is a reality that a lot of people find hard to accept. It's unreasonable to think that you are special and that you are unique and that you are meaningfully above the norm in terms of intelligence, capability, or skill. And even if you are those things, you didn't get those things. And anyone who has those skills, you didn't get those skills by doing normal things. Right? And so a lot of people want to go, oh, well, you've got to do normal stuff, just more discipline for a long time. And that's not really true, at least as far as business is concerned. Like, because if it was true, well, we work 40 hours a week for a really long time. But everyone does that.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone does that for 30 years or 40 years of their life, give or take, right?
It's the norm, and it gets them to normal outcomes.
Yeah, correct. So in a simple sense, to come back to your question, how hard should someone work or what should they do? It's like, well, if you want to get the best results, you should work as hard as you possibly can while still remaining effective in that time. And if you get to the point where you've worked so hard that your kind of value creation has dropped down per unit of time, then you should have a short break to recuperate, and then you should go straight back to working as hard as you can. Mm-hmm. And I think anything outside of that, if your expectation is great results, anything outside of that is therefore unreasonable because you're not willing to do the insane stuff to get the insane results.
Yep. So if you want to build a $100 million company, but you're not willing to do what it actually takes, then it may be worth refining your goals.
Yeah, and this is part of the harsh mirror that reality sometimes can be. Right. So you're kind of staring in the mirror in the morning, going, I want to build a squillion-dollar business. A reasonable set of questions would be, it's like, well, do I have the skills necessary to do that? If no, am I willing to do the work to get those skills? If no, well, what would be a reasonable basis upon which to have the expectation that you'll achieve an extreme result? If you are willing to get the skills or you've developed the skills, great. Now you can start working really hard. Mm-hmm. That's the beginning. Not the end.
I look at things, or not look at things. I look at I look at my life in a area or in a frame where I think I have 3 decade blocks that I can do meaningful. I can have meaningful outcome.
Yep.
I look at the first 10 years of growing my first company, and it's that you're working in the trenches. You're doing as much as you can in the rawest sense form because you haven't sharpened any axes yet. Yeah. You don't know what you're doing.
Yep, you haven't earned it yet.
Getting to the other side, I feel like I can start my next 10-year period with a lot more leverage. I can work a lot more effective, and I know how much more consistently I can push there.
Yep.
Do you think that this balance component is better referred to over a decade period instead of on a daily basis?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think at least in 5-year blocks. And so in my experience, we effectively built Sweat from kind of 0 to 100 million in about 5 years, depending on how you want to kind of frame it up. And the funniest part about that journey, because I worked, in my opinion, exceptionally hard during that particular period, and I would also say there's a really important delineation here between working hard and doing the hard work. So working hard, raw hours, doing the hard work, doing the things that need to be done, not doing what you want to do or enjoy doing, right? And so if you can find the great balance between those two things, working a huge amount of hours, but also in those hours doing the things that are absolutely necessary, even if you hate them, because you accept that they need to be done, as a product of getting where you want to go, is critically important. And so as I reflect on my journey, I think I worked a lot, but I also was very honestly focused on doing the things that needed to be done, not what I enjoyed doing. I didn't really care what I had to do. I would just do it because it was necessary. But as I reflect on that 5-year period or so, I would be very honest in saying that, by the time I got to the end of that journey, I was only moderately good. So a lot of people would look at that result and go, you've sold, $500 million worth of fitness products. Like, you clearly know a thing or two. And I'm like, well, I learned a thing or two, but I wouldn't have said that at the end of that journey that I was really competent across multiple dimensions. And so now in my own reflection, I believe that I'm far better after a couple of years of study, research and practice now than I was then. And so for the people who, to your point before, they're looking at it in days or weeks or months, it's just a too short time frame to actually get meaningfully good at anything. You've got to do things stupidly and inefficiently for years before you even realize that they are stupid and inefficient.
Yep. If you're not embarrassed by the work you did previously, then you're not growing fast enough.
Absolutely, yeah. And that, I think that's across every dimension, every area of the business, every function, every discipline, everything you do, you should be trying to meaningfully improve in all of those things. And a lot of people will look at, this, kind of mentality or philosophy and go, it's extreme or it's this or that or the other. But I bring you right back to the initial point. Most people who are trying to build a business are by default looking for an extreme result. And what I mean by that is if you look at your income, whether it's from a salary wage or a business that you own, if in Australia, kind of the mid-range salary is somewhere between 70 and 100K, depending on the way you want to measure that, the high end of that is somewhere around $250, to $350,000 a year individually. So that's sort of 1 and or 2 deviations above the norm. If you're looking for even 500 grand or $1 million a year, statistically, that is an extreme result. It's in the less than 1 percentile group of the entire population of Australia, at least, right? But then within that, although that's an extreme result, if you were then to reset that and make it not about everybody, but make the scale about all business owners, well, then $1 million is somewhere in the mid-range. The extreme is a much, much, much larger number. And so if you want to deviate from the general population, you have to do extreme to get to that point. But then at that point, you're still only mid-range as far as the next level of people that you're effectively competing against or measuring against.
Because as soon as you go to a next phase,
yes,
you're then playing in a deeper pool.
Yeah, they're just levels. And it's sort of like, I was a really good regional tennis player, and then I went to states and I was not that good. And then I got better and I was really good at the state level. And then I went to nationals and then I was just moderate. And so that kind of evolution journey, you're as a founder or an entrepreneur, and even for senior management, moving from company to company, your goal should be to constantly reinvent yourself so that you can adapt to the new level that you're trying to work towards. Not just, I'm better than this group now. And I would argue that, in a general consensus, like from a psychology standpoint, if you looked at the founders or business owners that were happy with that frame, they probably never got really that far down the extreme end of the spectrum. They got above normal, but they never really get to the extreme end.
They probably don't have exposure to that area as well. And that's the whole, not necessarily the keeping up with the Joneses, but the people that you're surrounded by and the people that you measure yourself, the yardstick by which you see your life. If there is nobody to push the needle there, then you inherently are the best. And that's conquering in your own mind.
Yeah. It's the whole, big fish, small pond bias, right? And I think, I would argue that for all people, employees, founders, or otherwise, one of the best things that you can do is figure out where is the next biggest pond. So that regardless of whether you're a big fish in your current pond or not, that you try to find a group of people, and or environments where you're not even remotely good, so you can use that as a recalibration exercise. Because you see this all the time. To your point, like, I live in a small town. I've kind of built this business. I'm killing it relative to the people that I'm around. But in the grand scheme of things, that may or may not even really kind of show up on the scale, if that makes sense. And I remember, my own version of this, because I went from being in high school to being a PT, making kind of a better part of $1 million a year, to then building an online business, making tens of millions of dollars a year in like a 3 or 4 year transition period. And so at that point in my career, much earlier on, I was like, I'm killing it. I'm doing great. And then I went overseas. I spent quite a lot of time in different countries, but mostly America. And over there, I met some founders who were like seriously wealthy relative to where I was at the time. And I was like, oh wow, okay. So in this group, back in kind of Adelaide, I was like, I thought I was doing it right.
You're the big dog.
Yeah. I was meaningfully doing meaningfully well. And then over there, there's just hundreds and thousands of people who are doing meaningfully better. And you spend some time around those sorts of people, and you realize that they're working at a different level, they're thinking at a different level. There's a reason why someone who makes $1 million a year thinks differently to someone who makes 50, and there's a reason that someone who makes $50 million a year thinks differently to someone who makes $1 billion a year. There are meaningful different thought processes at different levels.
I want to say some of your quotes back to you because they are straight fire. They are not only insightful, but they're also making some people a little bit uncomfortable. And I'd like to get the full description. I'd like to get the actual disclaimer that goes around the statements.
Sometimes the truth does make people uncomfortable. Yeah.
We're going to sweat for it.
Yeah.
Every time you say yes to something, you're also saying no to another opportunity. What do we mean?
Yeah, I mean, so this highlights, the simple idea of opportunity cost, right? So at any given point in time, you don't have unlimited resources, however you want to think about that, unlimited money or unlimited time. And so by virtue of that, for any dollar that you spend or any hour that you spend, that's you could have spent that dollar or that hour doing something else, right? And so when you highlight that, then the simple idea that would flow from that is, well, if I'm going to spend $1 or if I'm going to spend an hour, I want to be at least reasonably confident that that's value generating and or not just value generating, but high value generation relative to what I otherwise could have done. Because if it's not, well, then I am knowingly and willingly expending resources, capital or time, for a low return. And if your goal is to achieve better results, well, that needs to be a concentration of resources into high returning activities, right? And so it's a really interesting idea if we look at so like just a slight digression. If we look at the word entrepreneur, right, and you ask people now, what is an entrepreneur? Who are like, they're innovative, they're hustlers, they're doing all this sort of stuff, and that's normally based on the fact that people don't really know what that word is or means.
That's based on Instagram rules.
Yeah, literally.
Based on people's perception of what it should look like.
Yeah, and so a couple of hundred years back, a French economist, I don't know how to say it in France, but Jinsei, coined the term entrepreneur. A couple of different versions over the decades, but the summary was basically that an entrepreneur is someone who takes their existing resources that are deployed in the current way and redeploys them into things that are higher returning, right? And so if you look at the idea of opportunity cost, or everything you say yes to, you're also saying no to something else. Well, great entrepreneurs are really, really good at identifying the things they say no to are low returning and things they say yes to are high returning. If you just thought of that across every dimension of everything you do, great entrepreneurs do that better than ones that are not so great.
That would lead to think that to be a great entrepreneur or a great leader, it all comes down to decision making. Yeah,
I would agree. Yeah, well, I'm sure I've got some posts on that somewhere.
I'm sure we're going to get to them. So, if every decision can be a good or a bad decision, a lot of the people that would be listening would be weighing up quite an important decision. There'd be a great amount of opportunity cost that sits behind it, and that sits around the topic of a company is always at a certain point in time where they can only afford the leadership that they can afford. They can't yet reach to get the leadership that they need.
Yeah.
And this is through not only just executives, but even, the general management team, somewhere in that area. How do we put together a plan to make the right decision for the company as opposed to the right decision for what the company can afford right now?
Yeah. Well, this is an interesting idea in the sense that, so a couple of really basic first principles for decision making, right? So the first thing is that, more often than not, a decision is better than no decision, right? So a lot of people think that they're working through decisions, but they actually just never ever come to a decision, right? And that lag and or time between is inherently high risk, right? So a decision is better than no decision more often than not, unless the decision to not make a decision was proactive. So we are choosing not to do anything here.
You're acknowledging that we haven't made a decision as opposed to pushing it away.
Correct, yeah. And then off the back of that, so then if we kind of continue to look at like decision efficiency and lag, in a simple sense, if you have all the data that you can otherwise reasonably get, then there's no rational reason to delay the decision, right? So unless you believe you're going to get more information soon that's going to help to inform a greater decision, then you're at the maximum level, you're at a maximum informed position to then make the decision, even if the information that you have is low quality and not enough. If that's the maximum info you can get, well, then you should just make the decision, right? Because otherwise it's just...
Because the variables aren't going to change. It'd be no different to make it now than it would be in 4 months' time.
Yep, correct. And
except for opportunity cost.
Yeah, correct, yeah. And then but you could still argue then, even with the information you have, you'll be choosing not to make a decision because the opportunity cost is great, right? But then this highlights, a further thing. It's like, then we want to have all the information to make all of our decisions, right? And so the reality is that you will never have all of the information. And even if you have all of the information, very often the data that you're using to make decisions in business is not necessarily always high integrity data, right? And so when we kind of accept these ideas that we want to make decisions quickly, we want to make effective decisions, and we don't have all the data, you kind of start to come to this idea as like a lot of these things in business from a leadership or management perspective are making the best possible decision, kind of given the circumstances, but then really importantly having like a critical feedback loop. So like one of the issues is, to your point, that we can't always afford the level of leadership or management that we need. Another way of looking at that is like, but we can afford to be disciplined with the creation of a feedback loop for our decisions. Because arguably you could say, well, the best way to get better decision making is to learn the most from each decision you make. Because if you're learning the most from each decision, then theoretically you're getting progressively better at making them. But the issue is that most people don't make decisions at all. If they do then make a decision anyway, they make a decision off data that was not the quality that they needed, but then they use that as an excuse to justify the bad outcome. When
You rationalise it.
Correct, yeah. When instead what we should be doing is that, well, we're accepting that we have to make a decision. We should try to make it quickly. We're not going to have all the data that we need, but we'll be very disciplined in the way we measure the decision. So then in the future, when we have to make a similar one again, we can improve it. And so organizations, and this is sort of like not having the right management or the right leadership at this point in time for your business is sort of like saying, oh, we don't have enough money to do this thing. It's like, well, if you want to get to a point where you have enough money to do it or have the right management or leadership, you have to get the runs on the board or do the reps to earn that, right? And the best way to earn that is, well, make quick decisions as effectively as you can. Be really disciplined with how you measure the effectiveness of those decisions so you can get independently better. Because decision-making is ultimately a skill, right? If you're a really, really good independent critical thinker, you can make decisions in lots of fields that are not even your area just because you know how to think better.
Because you had a group of mental models to work with.
Yeah, exactly, because you have a way of thinking. And this is a really... at its core, a really simple idea, but a very elusive one for people who are early in their journey, and that is that the way we think or how we think about thinking, it comes under this idea of metacognition, right? So, how do you actually think about the way that you think about doing things, right? Which sounds a bit like we're in Inception, right? But it's a really valuable idea because if you're approaching any situation or problem, the first thing you should be trying to figure out is what is the right way to think about this. It's not how do I solve this. It's what's the right way to think about solving this. And just that small difference in problem solving is very, very meaningful as far as reliability, for the future. But the vast majority of people never really come to that conclusion. They go straight to, well, if this is a problem, well, here's all the solutions that we could have. As
straight
going
to solution-based.
Yeah, 100%. And so this is why the idea of having like a growth mindset or a solution-based mindset is valuable but inherently risky in some regard if your default to any problem is immediate to solution. Because, the simple example would be that if you're confronted with a series of problems and your immediate mindset is to solve them, then you've missed the opportunity to realize that it doesn't need to be solved, right? So like in engineering terms, this is the whole, there is nothing sillier that people do in engineering than create a wonderful solution for a problem that should never exist in the first place.
It's not different to worrying about a issue that doesn't yet exist. It's something that's
100%.
You could worry about as much as you want, but until it's a problem, it's not actually a problem.
100%.
Now to the frameworks for understanding how a decision is made. To circle back, the solution based is the second order, and that's a framework in and of itself.
Yeah.
Then, in order for us to make the decision on the solution, we need to have an understanding of the different mental models that are available, whether you are actively doing a thought experiment or not.
Yep.
How can some of the listeners who are aspiring to make better decisions, what are some of the mental models that we can pluck straight away when a decision is faced with us?
Yeah, I think two that come to mind to me that are inherently underrated, but very, very useful, probably are. So the first one is like root cause analysis. So rather than worrying about like what the solution is, let's try to get really, really articulate about what actually is the root cause of this thing. So not the symptom, but the actual problem itself. And then the second with that, which is kind of like a jab hook combo, if you want to think of it that way, is then once you've identified the root cause, then kind of circling back to, well, what actually is our goal here? So like objective oriented thinking. And so if you look at that like solution mindset thing, that's like a default to it's default to symptom solution. So, and there's a really clear, really important delineation here. Day-to-day business, a problem comes up, or at least that's what people think, but more often than not, the problems that are surfacing are actually symptoms of a root cause problem that is 2, 3, 4, 5 layers
of a
further
systemic
away.
issue.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, some systemic problem. And then so if you are able to kind of pull back the layers and get to the root cause and go, okay, well, this is a root cause. Well, like in this particular context, what actually is the need or the goal? Like, so the objective oriented, thinking, for example. And so like the thing here that presents itself very quickly when working with most people is that they very often don't actually have enough knowledge to do root cause analysis, or they don't have enough curiosity, to do root cause analysis. So,
because decision making for them up until that
Yeah.
point when they decide to understand about the way they actually come about decisions, it's all been based on instinct.
Yeah,
There's been no thought pattern behind
no model.
the way I
Yeah.
come about the decisions that I do make.
Yeah, and some really great examples of this are, we're running advertising campaigns, the ROAS is poor or the CAC is poor or whatever. Oh, yeah, no, I reckon we've got to get better creative, right? And it's like, well, but what, like, why actually is the marketing performance, like, is your campaign structure appropriate? Like, and then you can go even further back and it's like, well, is our product actually even useful or desirable to the people to whom we are advertising? So how many layers have you actually gone back to try to problem solve and address that rather than just going immediately to a solution? Because if you think about this, right, a lot of people get caught up and go, oh, we'll create 200 or 300 different forms of creative over 6 to 12 months and we'll test them and experiment. And you could have just wasted 12 months not learning that your product is actually just inherently not very good.
Mm-hmm. Or you could have just increased traffic on the top end and saved yourself all the dick around.
Yeah, and so like these are things that it's sort of like that idea that when you don't know, it's invisible and not obvious, but then when you see, it's like, how did I not know that this was here? So hindsight bias, right? It's like when we look back at like different problems we've solved in our life or different periods in our life, we're like, oh man, that was so obvious. I just couldn't see it when I was in it. But that's because when you're in it, you're not thinking methodically and you're more often trying to immediately get to the solution. And the interesting part of this here is if we acknowledge that there's ways of thinking that are critically important, the way that we think in a lot of circumstances is highly driven by emotion. So if you look at just from a general perspective, part of the reason why people kind of see problem and go to solution is because they're conditioned to want to move away from discomfort, right? And say, oh, no, like, this is not working, quick, we've got to fix it. It's like, well, do you need this? And if we did, like, what's actually even causing this? Like, could we design a solution here that means this problem never happens ever again? Right, but because as people, more often than not, we're conditioned to kind of as quickly as possible get away from discomfort, you're not actually able to get to the next like kind of level of value.
And it can give leaders a bit of a, I don't want to say ego stroke, but
huge.
It can give you a sense of power to
100%.
make decisions swiftly without any thought whatsoever.
Yeah, and this is like, why the idea, in my opinion, like from a people management perspective, you want to build a machine for the team members to exist in that allows them to be independent problem solvers. You want to build a machine that they can understand and they can diagnose the root cause themselves, right? Because otherwise the businesses are always inherently fully dependent on the founders or the senior most leader, which is a very vulnerable place to be.
Particularly if that person's leading straight out of instinct and have no framework surrounding them.
Yeah, correct.
Two of these mental models have been really helpful for me after you put me on to the Great Mental Models book.
Yep.
They are centered around the people management component or understanding some laws or some general rules of why people do things. They're Occam's razor and Hanlon's razor.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on both for us? So Occam being the simpler explanations are more likely to be true than the complicated ones. And then Hanlon's is we should not attribute to malice, which would otherwise be easily explained by stupidity. It's people do dumb shit all the time.
Yeah. So, I mean, just for the second one, like with Hanlon's razor, like you can, one way of looking at this, and some people in psychology terms will say like, oh, have a best intent mindset. So don't think people come here to do bad things or like deliberately try to do bad things. They kind of just happen. And very often because of people's, maybe another way of reframing stupidity, is like people's lack of awareness or lack of competency, right? I think, I think with like Occam's razor, I think there's a lot more value and nuance here. So in a I guess a simple way, like one way of looking at that is that people who are incredibly sophisticated at things are normally able to articulate them in simple terms, right? People who are not want to make them more complex a lot of the time because one, it makes them feel better, but two, because they feel like that the more complexity they discover, that the closer they're getting to the truth. But
it's like doing an open book test where they're like, here's all the information that I've regurgitated.
Yeah, exactly. But if you know the answer and you're able to kind of draw a direct line to each aspect of your thinking, from problem to root cause to solution, that's actually quite hard. And so I think even if you use something as simple as financial modeling, you see a lot of organized like e-commerce businesses, and they try to get their forecasting right, and they add in all these layers, all these variables, all this hyper complex stuff. But rather than having 50 variables, like how accurate could you get it with 5? and simplicity in that particular circumstance is better because that's easier for people to understand in a broad, kind of management perspective. And I think also as well, like when you're trying to solve problems, you're trying to actually break it down very often into its individual components or parts, but that requires you to make it simple. Yeah, and so making things simple is inherently really hard, but from like Occam's razor perspective, like that's actually making it simple is an accelerated way to understand the problem better. Yeah, and like I think a lot of the things with problem solving in that regard, like i.e. like breaking things into their individual components, people find that inherently really hard, and they feel the need to kind of ramble or babble and talk for a long time explaining a particular thing. When really it's like, well, this problem has these 5 components. These 5 components are dependent on these two or three variables. These things are in our control. These things are not in our control. The ones that are in our control, we either are or are not doing a very good job. Like there's not really, and you can use that exact framework for like 90% of business problems. Even if you don't know anything about the finance or the marketing of the product, you can use that framework as a way of breaking down most problems in business and probably in life.
It's not dissimilar to people who are like leading KPIs. We have 17 and this is the exact flow it goes in, as opposed to breaking it down and going, well, inherently if one doesn't work, the remaining don't line up. So let's pick the top and the core driver of that and simplify things down. Yeah,
and so, great example, right? Someone goes, oh, well, how do I effectively manage my e-commerce business? You want to start that by saying, well, revenue growth, gross margin, contribution margin, EBITDA margin, end, right? And if you can get people to understand what those things are, then that can get them to a point of going, well, the next obvious question, okay, well, what drives gross margin? What drives revenue and revenue growth? What drives contribution margin? And each of those have maybe 2 or 3 things that drive them. If you can get them to understand those things, firstly, you're already ahead of most organizations, but then you've provided a really, really simple way of thinking for the team to focus their work, effort and attention and drive results. But in the most insane way possible, most people don't understand those things. And so as a result of that, they're not able to drive great results.
Nor are they able to delegate any of the accountability because nobody knows what they're shooting for.
Yeah, and it all, like this is a thing, like a lot of people think, especially in small business, they go, everything's a mystery, Why are our results better or worse today? Like it's a mystery, they don't know. And that's just a representation of the fact that they haven't yet understood their business and been able to make it simple. They think that it's complex, or our competitors have done this, or, Trump has done that, or, whatever it means. Like, well, show me the core drivers. We had more or less traffic, a better or worse conversion rate, a better or worse AOV. If AOV was better or worse, well, that was better or worse units per order and better or worse ASP. If our margin was better or worse, well, that's a pricing or a ASP, like average cost price issue. Like, and you can break these things, each of these things down into individual 2 or 3 components.
Show me how the Trump election has affected that.
Yeah. And the reality is, even if it was the Trump election, you should still be able to have something that infers that particular thing impacted that metric, not just it impacted results.
It is, and it did.
Yes. And again, this comes back to the thing we were talking about before. People don't like the accountability piece. They don't like the feedback loop, and as a result of that avoidance, they can't ever improve their results and or the decision making, which drives the results.
You've said many people slow down their own progress because they misplace knowing it all versus knowing what matters. Learn just enough and experiment a lot. This leads in perfectly. How do we know how to learn? How do we know what actually matters? How can we pinpoint it?
So I think the easiest way to figure out what matters is to do the thing, right? And so what I mean by that is a lot of people will be like, I'm going to read all these books on marketing, all these books on finance, or whatever they may be. And I'm like, that's cool, but you only need to read enough to understand the basic words and the basic ideas, and then you need to go do the thing, right? Because doing the actual thing or the activity provides you data and feedback. Reading about it provides you no feedback. It's just information and ideas.
It's too conceptual when you don't get any feedback loop closures.
It's in some regards, it's useless, right? It's only useful insofar as giving you enough information to kind of have a dangerous conversation about it. So like from a finance perspective, like once you kind of know the primary words and whatever, then you actually need to go when you design a P&L, look at that, report on that, ask questions about that, and in that process you kind of build the skill, right? Because a lot of people will say like, oh, what book do I read to kind of go and do this thing? I'm like, well, do you kind of understand these primary ideas? What are they? I'm like, yep, I know those things. I'm like, well, then go do the thing.
What are you waiting for?
100%.
This is like the painful idea where there are very new, there are very early days business programs that say you need to have this business plan and you need to do a financial forecast. And if it's still a concept idea, how the hell are you going to put together a meaningful financial forecast that's going to be within 2,000% variance?
Yeah.
Because you don't have any runs on the board. We don't know
absolutely.
what we're actually working with.
Yeah, and one of the most, for a person who's been doing this for quite a long time, one of the most like upsetting things about this, because I very much like trying to help other management teams or founders kind of get to the next level is something I personally enjoy. And like one of the most painful things throughout that experience is they're like, I work with my lawyer or my accountant to put this together, and so they've gone to someone who they think is otherwise a trustworthy resource,
a professional,
who's been doing it for 20 years, only to be like misinformed. And this is a really, really important insight. No different to reading the book about accounting. If you read the book and you just believe that it's all true, well, you've kind of learned nothing, firstly. And secondly, you've also developed no skill. It's sort of like reading a book or watching a tutorial about how to fight someone. That doesn't mean that you're going to win the fight. You got to go and do the reps. Right? I mean, you know this like from your experience in jiu-jitsu, right? And so the knowledge skill gap is a really important thing to identify. And the issue is, especially in business, you see people doing interviews like this or doing media placements, and they're asked questions and they provide you kind of conceptual high-level answers. But it's really hard to delineate between someone who kind of knows the buzzwords and can provide the high-level answers, versus someone who truly knows, and not only knows but can do.
Yep.
Right. And so I think we spoke about this previously. When I'm interviewing people, like recruiting them for roles, I'm not super interested in the work that they've done. I'm more so interested in the way that they made the decisions to get there. Because if they can't articulate to me how they've made certain decisions, then I don't have any belief that they not only A, know anything, or B, can do anything. Right?
Can you operationalize it for us, or is that going to blow the cover on the surprise?
No.
Because you're walking into one today, I believe.
Yeah. I've got some. I'm doing some recruitment interviews today. So as an example, like let's say if you're recruiting for a senior operations person, and in your particular business, the expectation is that ops person is going to have some contribution to you creating kind of an operating scorecard or performance dashboards. Number one, and number two, assume they're going to have some contribution to strategic planning and or running the strategic planning cycle. If that's true, well, a really appropriate series of questions and or challenges that you might run in the interview process would be, just in advance of the interview on one page, one slide, can you articulate to me what, with the available public information, you believe our strategy is, right? And there's a couple of really great values from that. One is because they have to go do the work. And if they're not willing to do the work, well, you probably don't want them to work for you because they're not a good cultural fit, right? If they're willing to do the work and they go away and they have a crack at your strategy, whether it's right or wrong isn't the most important part. The value there is like, one, can they be articulate in their summary of what is otherwise a kind of multifactorial problem, number one. And number two, when they do get the result, regardless of whether it's right, wrong, or otherwise, can they explain to you how they arrived at that position? Right. So I thought your strategy was, market expansion to these countries. I can see you've got, multi-category product architecture. Presumably that's because of these reasons, X, Y, and Z. Cool, great. But how did you arrive there? Oh, well, I arrived there because when looking at other businesses and my understanding of the way businesses grow, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If they can articulate that, it's like, well, you've got a gem, right? Because their approach to thinking is sophisticated, right? If you use the example of creating performance dashboards or whatever it may be, and this is, one that trips up most people, they go, oh, well, what are the top 10 metrics? And they'll write you a list of 10 metrics. I'm like, cool. What other metrics make those ones move? And
what's the secondary? Yeah,
what's the second order of that data? So, and again, trying to use e-com businesses because it's a bit of a popular thing at the moment. Someone goes to you like, oh, it's conversion rate AOV. It's like, oh, how would you summarize that? Like if you only have one metric, like what would you choose? The appropriate answer would be RPV or revenue per view or visit. And you go, okay, well, what's meaningfully going to move that? Like what shifts conversion rate? And a person who has experience will go like, oh, geo mix, channel mix, device mix. There's kind of 2 or 3 primary drivers. Or what's going to change AOV? Oh, well, units per order, average sales price, geo mix for the traffic will change it. Like, and so someone who really knows, can explain these things.
The alternative person is go, well, We're going to engage some influencers. We're going to increase ad spend.
Yes.
Door open, get out.
They're looking at the work output, not the kind of drivers or inputs, but
they're failing to think about it, critically about it.
Yeah, and so there is of course in all of these business models and all these subject matter expertise areas, there is levels, right? But the overarching level that you're trying to ascertain in an interview process is what is the level of your thinking, and can you explain to me, in a straight line, kind of how you got here, and if they can't, at least for senior roles, if they can't in senior roles, then that's you're potentially hiring someone who can use the right buzzwords but can't actually get the work done.
Tobi, you always repeat this kind of phrase to me. It's a concept that helps us work out what we believe to be true and then what we don't yet know. Yep. It's our known knowns, our known unknowns, and our unknown unknowns. Can you unpack this for us so that the guys at home can use it?
Yeah. So in a simple sense, known knowns are things that exist and you're meaningfully a meaningfully large volume of information about. Your known unknowns are things like that you know that these things exist, but you also are aware that you don't really know a lot about those things, but you're aware of their existence. And then your unknown unknowns are things that you're not at all aware even exist, and therefore by virtue of that don't know anything about it. And I think from a skill and knowledge development perspective in business, you have kind of these, this multi-stream, process running at any point in time. You are ideally trying to figure out if your known knowns, like how can you get better and deeper knowledge and skill in that area. If your known unknowns, if they are relevant skill areas, then you need to bring them into your known knowns. So you need to study and kind of grow your knowledge and skill base there. And then for your unknown unknowns, these are things that you have to try to put yourself in environments and or around people that can help bring into your awareness things that you have no current awareness about, because on the other side of that, your lack of awareness could be like meaningfully valuable upside for you.
Would this be sat in kind of a frame where known knowns will be, I know I need to read this, do this, study this, take this course, do this program. The known unknowns would be that person's been where I've been before, so I'm going to seek that person to obtain some of that advice. Yeah,
it could be like, so the great one for most small business owners is like, I kind of know like finance roughly exists and there's kind of some like financial reporting, but I don't really know anything.
They open up with, I'm pretty good at I know my numbers.
Yeah. And then you ask them a couple of questions. They don't really know. But they know it's kind of there, but they don't really know it. And then the unknown unknowns are things like, you talk to most small business owners, they don't really know what like change management is. They don't really know what a lot of those ideas are from a people management perspective. Some things they've never even heard of them, right? And so if you were to go into, like a completely new area, let's say you had no computer science experience, like, I kind of know programming, but then there's this massive body of information and knowledge that you haven't even heard the words before. You have no awareness of its existence whatsoever. And so a lot of the risk that occurs for people is that they misallocate, or misattribute between the groups. So to the point before around finance, like, finance is a known for me. I know a bit about it, but you've misunderstood the difference between knowing it exists but not really knowing anything about it versus truly deeply knowing this thing. And that like kind of lack of self-awareness is inherently what slows down a lot of people. And some of that awareness can be fully involuntary. That is, they literally have no awareness, or they could be aware but afraid. They're not happy to acknowledge that they don't know something. And I think for like a lot of founders, they're very concerned with being right and very concerned with being the person that knows all the things, especially in the context of their team. They don't want to appear weak and vulnerable, which choosing to appear not weak and vulnerable is inherently putting you in a weak and vulnerable position.
Exactly. This is not like the start of the conversation. We're talking about you kind of have to sharpen your teeth. You have to sharpen your axe or cut your teeth in the early days. You have an area of known knowns that you are doing your work, and to the best of your ability, you know it.
Yes.
And then you get to a position where somebody shows you something, you've been inspired by something, or somebody has informed you of a area that you need to be, and you then unlock the known unknown component. Yeah. And from there, it's a perpetual cycle of I'm never good enough. It
can be a really sad experience. If your perspective is that you attribute your kind of self-esteem or self-worth or whatever to the knowledge that you do have. And this is a thing too, like great founders are typically people that get energized by a challenge and energized by learning, right? The founders that typically don't go quite as far, like the ones like, they start learning and they go, oh, this is really uncomfortable. This is kind of highlighting that I'm inadequate, et cetera, et cetera. But that's the way they see the world. That's not actually reality.
They may overlay it with a work-life balance title to rationalise the reason. Yes, and
they'll use all these elaborate elaborate philosophies, ideas, memes and quotes, to justify why it's okay they don't know this thing, and it's okay they're not working these hours, et cetera, et cetera. Because people, like I have said this a couple of times before, the only people who are really afraid of accountability are the ones who are worried they can't perform. Right? Like the people who are really accepting of accountability are the ones who like a challenge. The ones who want to kind of face up and fight against, the challenge, right? And so when you look at the people who are, again, the hyper successful business people are the ones who, they're happy to face into risk. They're happy to face into a challenge. They don't attribute their self-worth to knowing or not knowing something. They look at that as an opportunity to win, to triumph, right? And in my experience too, like I've, like I said, I built a business, up to $100 million in less than 5 years, and I thought I knew a fair bit. And then as I was working with a coach at the time. He's like, oh, go have a look at these books, and I start reading them, and my immediate default response was, oh shit, I don't even know what half these words are.
I can't understand it.
Yeah, and I can't immediately understand it, which is not a common experience for me. And I still remember, because this happens to me still now. But I still remember that point in time, and I remember having kind of a bit of my inner monologue being like, do I really need to know this? Do I really need to study this? Is this even relevant?
You'd be doing the textbook. I get 60, 70% of the way through a book and just be like, it's not sinking in. Yeah. This book's not right for me.
Yeah, exactly. And it's so easy to justify that. It's so easy to justify it. Let's not get out of bed in the morning. Do I really need to do this workout? Do I really have to eat that healthy meal? Do I really need to read this book? And, some people will look at that and they'll justify it away. I would look at it as weakness, right? In the context of your goals. If your goals are to achieve things that other people do not, then do not sit there and justify your own weakness by saying that it's not necessary. Because if you knew what was necessary or not, you would already have the things that you are striving to achieve. So if you already had the things, you would know that you need to do that shit. Right? And it's a self-perpetuating cycle, right? Like the amount of excuses and that people will use, which is really just a front for their own weakness and justification, or to avoid doing hard work or uncomfortable things. Like it's insane. And I work with founders all the time, and I commonly will say to them, I'm like, well, do you want to achieve this goal, yes or no? And if they say yes, I'm like, okay, well, are you or are you not willing to sacrifice what is necessary to get there? I'm like, and you need to ask yourself that question all the time. Every morning, every meeting, every hard conversation, every book that you don't want to read. It's like, well, do I really want to achieve this thing, right? And if you're even remotely uncertain about that, and you have that little bit of fear or whatever in that, then you either need to immediately accept the fact that you're not willing to do what is necessary to get the shit that you want in life, or you need to shut that voice up and just get on with it. Because you only really exist somewhere between those two extreme ends of the spectrum. You're either going to do it regardless of how it feels, or you're not going to do it because you can't handle how it feels. And you just got to kind of figure out what sort of person are you. Do you want to be a winner? Because if you want to be a winner, you got to identify as a winner, and you got to live your life like a winner. And if you're not willing to do those things, well, then you got to let go of this whole fantasy of being a winner, regardless of whether or not winning is working an hour a day in Bali on your laptop, or running a really huge business and becoming a really, really great founder or entrepreneur. Regardless of what winning is to you, if you're not willing to identify and behave as that person otherwise would, well, then you got to let go of that fantasy, because that's all it is. It's just a fantasy.
It becomes a game of standards, doesn't it?
Yes.
It's what standards will I hold for myself?
Yeah, and the standards that you hold for yourself are not the things that you do when everyone's looking. It's the shit that you do when no one's looking. Your standards are the things that you do when no one is looking. Your standards are the things that you do when no one is listening. The standards are the things that you do when you have lots of reasons not to do it, but you still do it just because it's your standard. Mm-hmm. No one's going to be there at midnight working with you on your laptop. No one's going to be there to get you out of bed first thing in the morning when you got to be somewhere. No one cares.
No one's going to tell you how good you are as well.
No, yeah,
it's probably going to come actually
100%.
At the inversion of that. It's going to come at a lot of conflict from those closest to you.
Yeah.
Because your attention is elsewhere.
100%. And the reality is too that everyone experiences the you know, kind of the shame, the fear, the discomfort, the self-doubt. Everyone experiences that. You know, talking with a friend of mine only the other day, you know, and you know, I think his business at his peak was doing the better part of $250 million a year. You know, he brings in a senior executive, you know, to come run the company. And he's like, dude, for 6 months, I was sitting there wondering if everything I've done building my business was wrong, because that person was telling me that everything that we were doing wasn't right. And then lets them run the company for 6 months, destroys the business, fires them, and then has to go in and fix it. Right? So there's these constant stimulus for uncertainty and you know, fear, you know, throughout the process. So if you're not like willing to repeatedly face into that and seek truth, you know, like what actually is the right thing here, coming all the way back to that decision making or problem solving thing.
Yep.
If you're not willing to do that 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, for like 10, 15 years, then don't expect extreme results, because that's the extreme stuff that you have to do that other people aren't doing. And because they aren't doing it, they won't get the extreme result. It's quite simple.
What's your definition of winning?
Depends on the point of my career, and yeah, exactly what I'm doing at that point in time. Like in the context of any business, winning to me is hitting the budget, right? And we define the budget based on what we think is achievable.
What variance are we talking?
Yeah. So I mean, look,
because you can exceed budget, but it makes you a pretty poor
we spoke
budget.
about this before. So my goal here is that, you know, ideally, like if you're really sophisticated, you know, mean average error rate will be a couple of percentage points, right? But yeah, there's a lot of things that will kind of go into impacting and changing that. I was saying to you before, I was running a leadership offsite for one of my companies yesterday, and yeah, I put the company's like consolidated profit and loss statement up on a TV in front of them, and yeah, pretty much everything was green. And there's a big thing at the top of the screen that says, "Well, why am I still upset?" And you know, and it was really great because the whole team knew the answer immediately, which was like, "Well, you're upset because despite the fact that we're winning and we're materially overperforming, that we were not able to predict that overperformance." Right. And so a lot of people would look at that and go, well, like, you're an idiot, you know, or you're insane. Like, why are you upset about winning? I'm like, well, because if we can't accurately predict the future in our business, then we don't understand it very well.
It's the biggest Tobi Pearce thing I've ever seen.
Standards, man.
It's all standards.
100%. And this is the thing. I care about everything, every detail, every conversation, every document, every note, every metric, every performance, every budget, everything. And, you know, and that, like, and people can argue as much as they like, but if you don't have that degree of obsession, you know, show me a person who's made hundreds of millions or billions of dollars who doesn't care about detail. Find me one. I challenge you. Find me one.
Take these high standards of yours. It is obvious. Take them and share with us what the normal Tobi looks like. What is a day in the life of Mr. Tobi Pearce?
Eyes open. Husband duties. Dad duties. Work. Eyes closed.
Grappling.
Yeah, somewhere in there. Occasionally some grappling. So when I say that, you know, to me, so you know, my standards that I have in work and my goals and aspirations are equally matched by my standards in my relationship with both my wife and daughter. And so I have this like idea with me because I'm, you know, I think anyone can relate, you know, as a parent in general. It's like you get tired a lot, you know, and if you're working a lot, you get tired more. But I always say to myself, like, no degree of my exhaustion is a reasonable justification to not show up for my daughter, and no amount of my own exhaustion is reasonable to not show up for my wife, because these were decisions and commitments I made, right? In the same regard that no amount of my exhaustion is a reasonable justification to not show up for my team members. You know, so the same standard should, in my opinion, the same standard should permeate the group. You know, so if I'm getting up in the morning, I make a coffee every morning for Rachel. You know, my wife is the thing. We hang out, do the dad duties with my daughter. You know, kind of drop her off at school, and then it's work as much as possible. Pick her up. Normally, I go to her with gymnastics, and then she'll come with me to jiu-jitsu, and then I go back and, you know, kind of cook dinner and whatever with Rach and Anna. And then, you know, once Anna goes to bed, so, you know, a bit of husband time with Rach, and then after she goes to bed, then I work. And I work anywhere from 9 to 9:30 p.m. through until midnight at 1 a.m. And then I go to bed, and then I'll get up and do it all over again. And that's my life. And for me, not only am I willing to do that because I have, you know, otherwise exceptional goals, you know, relative to the mean, but also I love that. So like for me, it's not draining to do those things. To me, I want to win, you know, in all those areas. And yeah, I mean, you know this because we've been mates for some time. Like, you could argue that wanting to win so much and upholding high standards is, you know, you're unhealthy or harsh or this or that or the other. It's like, well, justifying low standards is more unhealthy.
If you take the the title, the noun of work out and just left it at life balance. That is what a high standard life balance looks like.
Yeah, for someone who has my goals and has my values, right? And I think at the end of the day, like to the point earlier, it's like a lot of my work per se, like to me, that's one of my ultimate challenges to strive against, right? That's one of my ultimate personal development opportunities. I see that as a game, right? Because I think if you attach too much to the end result, you end up getting upset a lot, because the end result is fundamentally by the term, it's at the end. And so you don't get the result during the journey. And so if you attach yourself to the end result, but you are fundamentally not at the end of that particular aspect of your journey, then you're actually constantly in a deficit. So you're constantly
You put
upset.
yourself in that trap of going, if I achieve this, I will be happy.
Yeah, correct.
And then you grind under the premise that at some point I will be happy, as opposed to enjoying the process of it.
Yeah. And so like, to the question before, like what is winning? Like winning for me is getting better at all the things I do constantly. Like that like in a simpler sense, because I understand that the outcome is predicated on getting better. The outcome is not just the outcome. Right. And so if I can say, well, I can get better at all of my skills in business, I can kind of be a better husband or a better dad or get better at jiu-jitsu, whatever it may be. Don't know about that one. But if I can constantly try to get better at those things, that's kind of the point. The purpose is the journey. The purpose is the challenge. The purpose is to strive and get better. The purpose isn't, it's not the end outcome.
Do you have that well-articulated purpose statement?
Look, on a business-to-business basis, yeah. But I would argue that, on a personal basis, in some regards, like my purpose just is my journey. Like I think a lot of people get lost in trying to be too articulate about that. But for me, like I know, at least at this point in time, with my current degree of self-awareness, that the thing that is best for me is to constantly be striving. I am in like flow state, and am I happiest and most peaceful when I'm challenged.
It's powerful, Mr. Pearce. Mate, thank you very much for joining us on the show.
Thanks
I really
for hosting
appreciate
me.
it.
Thanks, man.